Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. This case takes us to Australia, to a quiet, residential suburb called Brighton East, just outside Melbourne. It was 2017, and in one of the houses on a regular tree-lined street, something unthinkable was about to unfold. The house was shared by 3 men housemates who decided to make a bit of extra money by renting out their spare bedroom on Airbnb. It was a typical setup: 1 house, 4 bedrooms. 3 of them are occupied by long-term residents, and 1 listed online for passing travelers. Let's start with the youngest of the 3, Craig Levy. Craig was 36 years old at the time. He worked as a chef in a local restaurant, and that was kind of it. He didn't have any major relationships, no serious girlfriend, at least none that anyone knew of. There was nothing particularly unusual about Craig, nothing striking or overly memorable. He was just a guy living with 2 mates, going to work, coming home, and renting out a room. Then there was the second housemate, Ryan Smart. Ryan was just a year older than Craig, so they were more or less the same age. But Ryan's life, it had been much harder. He grew up in a traumatic, unstable home. His father was an alcoholic who eventually walked out on the family altogether. That left Ryan in the care of his mother, who, heartbreakingly, was also an alcoholic. But her situation was even worse. She was heavily addicted to hard drugs and couldn't properly care for Ryan or his siblings. At one point, Ryan's older sister was sectioned under the Mental Health Act, meaning she was forcibly taken to a psychiatric hospital for her own safety. And when she was released, she wasn't allowed to return home. It was deemed too dangerous, too unstable. And that's something I've never quite understood. If it was unsafe for her to return to that house, why wasn't it unsafe for Ryan too? It's one of those failures of the system that just leaves you with a knot in your stomach. So Ryan stayed behind, alone. His sister went into care, and he was left with a mother whose drug use only got worse. By the time Ryan reached his teens, she was so far gone that she had to be placed in a care home herself. And just like that, Ryan was on his own, expected to survive, grow, build a life, and find stability, all without ever really having seen what that looked like. But he wasn't ready, not even close. He tried, he really did. But he couldn't keep a job, couldn't hold on to friendships, couldn't figure out how to exist in a world that had never taught him how to belong. And eventually, like the pattern he'd grown up with, Ryan turned to drugs. His dependencies became part of his daily life: meth, ecstasy, LSD, alcohol, cannabis. Most days he was using 1 or more of these substances just to cope, just to feel something, or maybe to feel nothing. It's terrifying to imagine someone trying to build a life on a foundation that is broken. But that's what Ryan was doing, or at least trying to do, from inside that house in Brighton East. So that was Ryan broken by the system, numb by substances, and now we come to the third and final housemate, the oldest of the 3, Jason Colton. Jason was 41 years old in 2017, and on the surface, his story couldn't have looked more different from Ryan's price. In fact, in many ways, he was the opposite. He came from a good family, a healthy home, and a privileged upbringing. He attended private school, had loving parents, and was never in any kind of trouble growing up. There were no red flags, no abuse, no neglect, nothing to suggest he'd end up on a dark path. But something changed. In his 20s, Jason met a woman, a Norwegian woman, while she was living in Australia. The 2 of them fell in love, and not long after, Jason moved to Norway to be with her. They even had a son together, and that's when everything started to unravel. Jason became abusive, violent, not just with his partner, but with their child too. He wasn't just unpredictable, he was dangerous, and it didn't stop at home. Jason was getting into bar fights, street fights, random violent altercations that had nothing to do with personal disputes. It was like the violence was just part of him now. He was angry, volatile, and always ready to explode. During his time in Norway, which honestly wasn't even that long, Jason appeared in court 4 separate times for violent behavior. And one of those incidents was especially horrifying. It was late at night. Jason's housemate, just a regular guy, was asleep in bed, completely unaware, completely defenseless. And out of nowhere, Jason walked into his room, grabbed him by the throat, and started beating him in the head with his fists. Unprovoked. No fight, no warning, just blind, uncontrolled rage. And I can't help but wonder, what flips a switch like that in someone who seemed to have everything? Because Jason didn't grow up like Ryan. He didn't suffer childhood trauma. He wasn't neglected. He had stability, support, and opportunity. And yet, he became this. For the attack, Jason was sentenced to 5 months in prison in Norway. And after serving his time, the country made a decision. They deported him, put him on a plane, and sent him back to Australia. As far as we know, he never saw his ex-girlfriend or his son again. And now, years later, Jason was living in Brighton East, back in Australia, sharing a house with Craig and Ryan, renting out the 4th bedroom to strangers on Airbnb. No one knew yet that this house, this ordinary suburban home, was about to become the scene of something truly disturbing. So that's the trio: Craig, the quiet chef, Ryan, the deeply damaged drifter, and Jason, the violent and unpredictable ex-con. Quite the friend group, right? These 3 men, all with wildly different pasts, but all carrying their own chaos, were living under one roof in Brighton East. And as you can probably imagine, it was a turbulent household. Loud, messy, dark. Now, I don't have a play-by-play of what went on in that house every single day, but what we do know is that it wasn't exactly the kind of environment you'd want to invite strangers into. There were drugs, lots of them. There were fights, theft, and the police were there often, sometimes for noise, sometimes for violence, sometimes for reasons no one would even explain. There was always something. But despite the instability, despite the fact that their lives weren't just messy but actively unsafe, the 3 of them decided it would be a good idea to list their spare room on Airbnb. And we're not talking about a full private unit here. It was just 1 bedroom in a house share setup. That meant any guest who booked it would be living among these 3 men, sharing a hallway, a bathroom, a kitchen, and the tension in the air. It was listed for about $30 a night cheap. Really cheap, especially for Melbourne. So of course, it booked up fast. Travelers on a budget, students, backpackers, people looking for somewhere quick, somewhere affordable. But they had no idea what they were walking into. And it didn't take long for reviews to start piling up. Bad ones, angry ones, terrified ones. One guest wrote that they felt unsafe, uncomfortable, and said their property was stolen, presumably by one of the hosts. I mean, who else could it have been? It's unthinkable, really. Imagine paying for a room and getting robbed by the person handing you the keys. Another guest didn't even try to be subtle. Their review read, "A better way to spend the night would be to buy a $50 hammer, smash your hand with it, and then go to the emergency hospital." That's brutal. But honestly, it says everything you need to know about the energy of this house. For the guests who stayed there, it wasn't just a disappointing experience, it was hell on earth. In October of 2017, the house in Brighton East took in yet another guest. Just one more name on the Airbnb booking sheet. His name was Ramis Januzzi. Ramis was 36 years old, the same age as Craig, actually, and at this point in his life, things were falling apart. He'd just come out of a long-term relationship. 8 years with the same partner, a man he trusted, lived with, loved. But the relationship had ended in betrayal. Ramis had been cheated on, and everything he thought was stable had crumbled beneath him. To make things worse, the home he'd been living in was their home. So when the relationship ended, Ramis had no choice but to move out. He ended up back at his parents' house, which for anyone in their 30s who had once built an independent life can feel like a massive, painful step backward. The emotional fallout from the breakup hit him hard. And with everything else crashing down, Ramis started using drugs to numb the pain. It wasn't about partying. It wasn't recreational. It was an escape. And like so many others who try to self-medicate grief, he didn't realize how deep he was falling until he was already drowning. His drug use became a dependence. And soon, it wasn't just emotional pain he was running from. It was withdrawal and everything that came with it. At one point, things got so bad that his sister dragged him to the hospital, desperate to get him help. She could see what was happening. She could see him slipping. But by then, Rames's problems had multiplied. His behavior changed. The drug use was affecting how he acted around people. Eventually, his own family couldn't live with him anymore, and he was kicked out. That's how he ended up sleeping in his car. Alone, heartbroken, addicted, homeless. He had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. He needed somewhere cheap, fast, just to get off the street, just to breathe for a few days. That's when he turned to Airbnb. And there it was. A room for $30 a night, just outside Melbourne, in a house with 3 guys. No red flags on the listing. Just a cheap room available immediately. So he booked it. 3 nights, that's all. And then he made his way to Brighton East to meet the 3 men who would be his temporary housemates. Ryan Smart, Craig Levy, and Jason Colton. From the moment Rames Januzzi stepped into that house in Brighton East, he could feel something was wrong. The energy was off, heavy, hostile. There was nothing warm or welcoming about the place. The atmosphere was tense, the kind that makes your stomach tighten without really knowing why. But Rames had no other choice, not really. This was the cheapest room he could find, and he was desperate. Just 3 nights, he told himself. He could handle anything for 3 nights, and for a while he tried to settle in. A little way into his stay, Rames ended up opening up to Craig Levy, the quietest of the 3 men. Maybe he saw something softer in Craig, something he thought he could trust. He started telling Craig about what was going on in his life, that he didn't have money, that his life was falling apart, that he had nowhere to go once his time at the Airbnb was up. He was honest, vulnerable, desperate. And then he started begging Craig to let him stay a little longer, even if he couldn't pay, just until he figured something out. He even pulled out his phone and opened his banking app to show Craig the truth. His account had $6 in it. That was it. And I think it's hard to imagine the kind of shame that must come with that moment, literally begging someone for a place to sleep, showing them how broke you are, hoping they'll see the humanity in you instead of the burden. Eventually, Craig gave in. He told Rames he could stay until the end of the week, but after that, he had to go. They needed paying guests in the room, and they couldn't afford to let someone just stay for free long term. For Rames, that offer was a relief. It bought him some time, just a few more days to figure something out, anything. But a couple of days later, Craig changed his mind. He told Rames that he wanted him to pay for all the nights he had stayed, including the ones he just said could be free. Suddenly, what was once a lifeline turned into a debt. Rames pleaded with him. He reminded Craig of what they'd agreed. He even pulled out his phone again, showing the same bank balance, still just $6. Nothing had changed. But Craig didn't care. He saw the empty account, saw the panic in Rames's eyes, and he still demanded the money. By now, Rames had stayed about a week in the house. The total cost had grown to around $200, maybe $210. It was double what he ever planned to spend and far more than he could pay. And that debt, that $200 of tension, was about to turn into something far more dangerous. By the 25th of October, 2017, things inside the Brighton East house had gone from tense to toxic. That day, Craig Levy finally decided it was time to confront Rames. He told him plainly, if you can't pay, then you have to leave. Today, right now. Rames, desperate, somehow managed to stall for a little longer. Maybe it was his voice. Maybe it was his face. Maybe Craig was just tired. But for whatever reason, Rames managed to get a few more hours inside the house. But you can imagine what that atmosphere felt like. Unbearably hostile. The 3 men wanted him gone. He had no money, no backup plan. And with each passing hour, Rames was begging just to stay a little longer, hour by hour, conversation by conversation. He told them that if they made him leave, he would have nowhere to go. that he'd be on the street, that he couldn't even buy food, but none of them cared. They had decided he was a problem, and they wanted him out. Earlier that same day, the three of them, Craig, Ryan, and Jason, had made a decision. Today's the day. He's gone by midnight. And they weren't just expecting him to leave, they still wanted that $200 too. They weren't going to take no for an answer. By around 6 p.m., Ryan and Jason left the house to go drink at the pub, leaving Craig alone with Ramus. Craig's job now was to get him out, alone. That night, Craig was in his bedroom playing Xbox, but every so often, he'd pause the game, walk down the hall, and start pressuring Ramus again, pay, leave, now. Then he'd go back to gaming, wait a little, and do it again. It was relentless. At one point, Jason texted Craig from the pub asking for an update. Craig replied, he's getting somewhere, but stalling. Ramus was slowly packing, tidying the room, trying to make sure he left things clean. But Craig thought he was deliberately dragging it out, and that just made him even angrier. Eventually, Ramus walked into Craig's room to say he was done that. He'd packed everything, cleaned up, and was ready to leave. He asked Craig to come check the bedroom to make sure it was in good condition. And it was. Clean, quiet, exactly how it had been when he arrived. That should have been it. But then Craig asked for the house key back, the one they'd given him at the start of his stay. And Ramus went quiet. He looked at Craig and confessed that he didn't have the key anymore. A few days earlier, he'd been picked up by police, caught with drugs on the street, and during the arrest, the key had been confiscated. It was now sitting at the police station. Craig snapped. To him, it wasn't just about the key. It was one more screw-up, one more hassle, one more reason to be furious at the man they already hated having in their house. Now, they couldn't even rent the room until they got a new key, and that meant going down to the police station, which none of them were willing to do. They all hated the police, avoided them like the plague, probably because they had good reason to. Between the drugs, the violence, the illegal activity, they didn't want to set foot near a cop shop. And now this guy, this broke, quiet stranger who had nowhere else to go, had just ruined their business in their eyes. It was just one more reason to hate Ramus Januzzi. And things were about to get so much worse. Craig was losing it. He started screaming at Ramus, demanding the money again, the same $200 that he already knew Ramus didn't have. His voice echoed through the house, filled with fury, as if somehow yelling louder would make the cash appear out of thin air. Ramus, still trying to survive this moment, told Craig he was going to step outside and call his boss. Maybe, just maybe, he could beg for an early payment. Something, anything. But it was already late, around 8 p.m., and either his boss didn't answer or wasn't willing to send money at that hour. So, after a few minutes outside, Ramus came back in empty-handed. By now, Jason and Ryan had returned from the pub. Ryan had gone upstairs to his bedroom, but Jason was in the living room, pacing, waiting. He was more furious than anyone else. He hadn't gone upstairs for a reason. He wanted to confront Ramus himself. The moment Ramus stepped back inside, Jason snapped. He started screaming, hurling insults, calling him every name you could think of. And I mean, what did they really expect? They had seen his bank balance twice. They knew he had $6 to his name. Where did they think this magical pile of cash was going to come from? I get that they were angry, sure. But yelling at someone for being poor when you already know they're broke? That's not anger anymore. That's cruelty. Jason got right up in Ramus's face, intimidating him, towering over him, shouting louder and louder, and then, according to Jason, Ramus gave him a dirty look. That was all it took. Jason lunged. He grabbed Ramus in a headlock and started punching him in the head, over and over. The attack was sudden, explosive. It took about 5 seconds before Craig joined in. Now, it wasn't just one man attacking Ramus, it was two. They kept screaming as they hit him. It was loud enough that Ryan, upstairs, heard the commotion and came downstairs to see what was happening. And just like that, he joined in too. All three of them, Jason, Craig, and Ryan, were now beating Ramus. Punching, kicking, stomping. Ramus was on the ground, defenseless, bleeding, his body unable to fight back. At one point, His blood started soaking into the carpet, onto the furniture. And in that moment, the concern wasn't about what they were doing, it was about the mess. This was Airbnb, after all. They didn't want to ruin their rental setup. So they grabbed Rama's limp and broke in and dragged him outside, threw him into the backyard like trash. And now, with no carpet or couch to stain, they knew they could keep going without having to clean up after it. Ramus couldn't even stand up. He was just lying there in the dirt as the attack continued. Now that they were outside with no furniture to ruin, no carpet to stain, the beating didn't stop. The first thing Ryan Smart did was put Ramos Januzzi in what's called a 4-figure leg lock. It's a move you'd see in wrestling or MMA, a way of twisting the legs so the person is pinned and completely immobilized. Not that Ramus could move anyway. He was already so brutally injured and exhausted from the attack inside that he could barely lift his head, but now, with his legs twisted beneath him, he had no way to even try to fight back. He was just exposed, vulnerable, laid out on the ground like he wasn't even human anymore. His chest and head were left open, and Craig and Jason took full advantage of that. They kept going, punching, kicking, beating. There was no pause, no hesitation, just this relentless, merciless violence. And then it got even more disturbing. At one point, Craig grabbed Ramos's phone off the ground, walked over to him, and lifted his head up, not out of care, but so that Face ID would unlock the phone. He held it to Ramos's broken, swollen face. And when it unlocked, Craig went straight to his banking app. Still only $6. That was it. And something about that moment, about opening a man's phone while he's bleeding out in the backyard, just to double check that he's still poor, is almost beyond cruelty. It's cold, robotic. Like Ramos was nothing more than a balance sheet to them. Craig walked back inside after that, and then he called the police. Now, this part's a little unclear. Some sources say he called them because they were finally done, that they decided enough was enough, and they wanted to end it there. Others suggest something even more twisted, that Craig genuinely believed the police would come help them, that they thought this wasn't a crime, because somehow, in their heads, they were the victims. They believed they had a right to hurt Ramus, that his inability to pay $200 justified all of this, that they could beat him to the brink of death and still stand there and say, but he owed us rent. And the fact that they might have thought the police would take their side, it's hard to even wrap your head around that level of delusion. But the call had been made, and Ramus was still lying there. So now Craig was inside the house, on the phone with police, while outside in the backyard, Ryan still had Ramus Januzzi locked in that figure 4 leg hold, completely immobilized, pinned to the dirt. And Jason made his next move. He walked around to the front of the house to where Ramus's car was parked. Maybe he thought there was money inside. Maybe he was just looking for something, anything to justify the last hour of violence. Something to steal, something to hold up and say, see, we got something back. He rifled through the car, and all he found was a hard-shell pencil case, the kind you'd use for pens or calligraphy tools. That was it. No wallet, no money, no valuables. So he took the pencil case. Jason walked back to the backyard, where Ramus was still on the ground, barely conscious, slipping in and out of awareness. His body was giving up. Jason walked over, pulled Ramus's pants down, and forced the pencil case inside him. It wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about rent. This was about power, control, about humiliation so deep it barely has words. And the worst part is they knew what they were doing. They knew how badly Ramus was hurt, that he was barely breathing, that he was slipping away. But they didn't care. After that, both Ryan and Jason let go of him. They left him there bloodied, broken, his body twisted in pain. Ramus lay motionless, barely able to stay awake. He kept blacking out, struggling to hold on. He was dying right there on the cold, hard ground. Meanwhile, Jason ran back into the house. He tore off his hoodie, now soaked in Ramus's blood, and tried to hide it, because now They knew the police were on their way, and they were finally starting to think about what might happen when they arrived. But they didn't have much time. Within minutes, officers pulled up outside the house, responding to Craig's call. And much to the men's surprise, the police didn't want to hear their story. They didn't ask about the rent, they didn't ask who owed what, they ran straight to Ramos. And when they saw him, his body, his injuries, the state he was in, there was no question. He needed help, immediately. But they were cops, not medics. There was only so much they could do. And Ramos didn't have much time. Police called for an ambulance the moment they saw the state Ramos Januzzi was in. But every second they waited was another second Ramos spent dying on the ground. By the time paramedics arrived, he was unconscious. There was no response. They tried everything they could to resuscitate him, worked on him right there in the yard, in the dark, surrounded by the men who had done this to him. But nothing worked. At 9:13 p.m., just over an hour after the attack began, Ramos Januzzi was pronounced dead. 1 hour. That's how long he had endured it. 1 hour of begging, of beatings, of humiliation and horror. The autopsy confirmed the damage. Ramos had died from compression to the neck and blunt force trauma to the head. At one point during the attack, one of the men is believed to be Jason, had stood on his neck. And of course he had been punched, kicked, and beaten continuously over that hour. A toxicology report also revealed that Ramos had modest levels of methamphetamine, amphetamine, and codeine in his system at the time of his death. It's believed these drugs may have contributed to how quickly his body shut down, that the stress they put on his heart made the brutal assault even more lethal. And while no one knows for certain when he last took them, it's widely believed that Ramos had willingly taken the substances himself. This wasn't something the men forced on him. It was part of the long spiral he'd been caught in, using drugs to numb pain, to get through the day, to survive the emotional collapse of his life. And I think it's important to say that doesn't make him less of a victim. If anything, it shows just how vulnerable he truly was. His body was already fighting to survive even before the attack began. And when that violence came fast, brutal, and relentless, his heart just couldn't take it. Now, police were standing in the backyard of a murder scene, and it was immediately, painfully obvious who was responsible. There were 3 men, all still at the house: Craig Levy, Ryan Smart, and Jason Colton. And they were the same men who had been screaming at the victim, demanding money minutes before he died. And yet, despite everything, despite the condition of Ramos's body, the blood, the injuries, the horror, Jason and the others began trying to defend themselves. Jason insisted they acted in self-defense. He claimed that Ramos started the fight, that he had somehow turned violent first, that they were just reacting. And then Jason gave a statement that would almost be laughable if it weren't so vile. He started it, he hit us with a car tool. That was his explanation. And honestly, I don't know what's more infuriating, the fact that he said that with a straight face, or the fact that he thought anyone would believe it. Like this was some kind of schoolyard scuffle, not a one-sided torture attack that left a man dead. Because how do you call that self-defense? How do you call it self-defense when you and 2 others sodomize a man with a pencil case? When you kick him in the head, beat him while he's pinned, and then drag him into the yard to bleed out? And the thing that sealed it beyond any debate was the fact that none of the 3 men had a single wound, not even a scratch. Ramos never fought back. He couldn't. He was too injured, too weak, too far gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken skin, no defensive wounds on the attackers, nothing to suggest even for a second that this was mutual. It was a one-sided act of rage, a prolonged, violent execution under the guise of a petty rent dispute. The police knew it. They didn't need more convincing. Right there on the scene, all 3 men were arrested, charged on suspicion of murder. All 3 men, Craig Levy, Ryan Smart, and Jason Colton, were brought to trial for murder. But as the case developed, it became clear they were all going to take a plea deal. Instead of facing life for murder, they would plead guilty to manslaughter. But even before their sentences were handed down, they showed the court exactly who they were. Jason Colton, the most violent of the three, stood in front of the courtroom, in front of the public, the media, and Rames's grieving family and said, "In my eyes, he deserved everything he got. He hadn't shown any respect to anyone in the house. It was like he still thought this was about rent, like $200 and some imagined slight justified an hour-long torturous beating. He didn't show remorse, not even a flicker. And during the trial, something else came out, something that made the whole thing even more heartbreaking. A neighbor, a woman who lived just a few doors down from the house, had heard the entire thing. She had listened to the screaming, to the shouting, to Ramus crying out in agony as he was beaten to death. This is what she told the court. It was a man screaming at the top of his lungs. It sounded like aggressive male behavior, and I wasn't going anywhere near that. And I get it to some degree. If you're a woman alone and you hear something that sounds dangerous, you don't just walk into it. But at the same time, she had a phone. She could have called for help. She could have saved him, or at least tried. And I think that's one of the hardest parts to sit with, knowing that someone heard him die and chose to do nothing. In the end, all three men pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Craig Levy was sentenced to 7.5 years. Ryan Smart was given 9 years. And Jason Colton, the ringleader, the most brutal of them all, got 13 years in prison. Just 13 years for what they did.